Você, 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 você. Welcome to another episode of Arrays of Living. And this episode is part of our Inclusivity Series, and it is called Cultural Relations. And what is amazing about this is I'm with a guest, and you all know I love my guest experiences. I am sitting here with Dr. Amara Pope, and I will let her introduce herself in a moment. In this episode, all my inclusivity series are touching upon societal things that we need to become more aware and sensitive to that will accept everyone, whether they're an animal, whether they're human, whether it's a situation, whether it is physical circumstances, mental circumstances. Is about how do we become sensitive to others around us so that we show compassion, love, and acceptance of everyone. So, on this episode, let me introduce Dr. Amara Pope. Dr. Amara, thank you for joining us. And maybe you can just take this light right now to just speak about yourself, and then we'll jump into the discussion.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to have this chat with you. My name is Dr. Amara Pope. I am a TEDx speaker. I have 10 plus years in marketing across many different industries, and I'm a PhD graduate. So I studied media and marketing in my academic background.
And now we're here talking about cultural relations. So maybe you can bridge the gap between your
Yeah.
marketing to the cultural piece.
So yes, my PhD was looking at the rise of Canadian R&B and the marketing and brand strategies of many different artists. And the reason that relates to identity and cultural marketing is because I looked at how music genre categories are often traditionally organized through racial identities or national identities. So I found that a lot of popular culture continues to be organized by constructs of race and nationality. And that's something that informed my academic research as well as my marketing work. In marketing, I look at how different cultural identities can represent more diversity across many different spaces, whether that's a digital ad or a public panel where we invite multiple speakers to come and represent their diversity. It's very important in both the academic space as well as the industry space. And I think we still have a lot more to go in representing diversity today.
Absolutely, and as certainly as someone that's in the cultural, affinity of society, and I don't like to put labels on myself, I don't even like to put labels on other people, but you all know that I have a cultural affinity, and it's around the West Indies. But
Mhm.
how that gets defined from being raised and brought up in North America is a whole different picture. So one
Yeah.
of the things, let's hit on the music, Dr. Amara, because that's where your PhD. So let's spend a little time talking about music as it relates to cultural relations.
Yes. So in Canada specifically, I'm also a minority woman who was born and raised in Canada, but my parents are from from Trinidad and Tobago, and so I have grown up around music, calypso, reggae, soca, and music is just part of my blood. So that I didn't realize, but I end up coming into my academic studies. I personally experienced racism, and I was very much othered in a Canadian society that was predominantly white. I was born and raised in Scarborough, where it was very diverse, and then moved to a small town in Ontario. And I found that the radio, the television, my immediate surroundings didn't have anybody who looked like me. And so I was very curious about how Canadian music came to fruition in terms of why was it predominantly white, rock, and folk artists on TV, on the radio. And so when I was researching Canadian R&B, I found that we had such a rich culture in quote unquote what's called black music, and that's anything like reggae, soca, calypso, hip hop, R&B. But because of that association with blackness or non-white identities, a lot of that music was pushed the periphery of Canadian society, meaning that those artists and that those genre styles didn't get any recognition or publicity in Canada. Many of them had to work together outside of mainstream media and move to the States to get recognition to finally build their success in Canada. They had to actually go outside of Canada to build their careers before getting recognized here. So I was really interested in why that occurred. And when I was looking at the construction of Canadian music industries, I saw that it was this idea of having a predominantly white sound and style that many of these white music industry gatekeepers was trying to create to represent Canadianness.
And that's really interesting because I'll tell
Mhm.
you what just came to mind. I honestly did not plan this. Do you remember the times of WBLK in Buffalo
Yes.
and
Yes.
how?
And
Okay,
yeah, and and it's funny because I talk about that in my dissertation, and you
I
describe,
didn't know. I swear,
it's
as you were
crazy,
talking,
yeah.
I swear it was a plan. I recalled, oh my God, the times of WBLK was the
Mhm.
only, you know,
Way.
black oriented, and my hands are up in quote with the black word because you know how I feel
Yeah.
about that
Yeah, yeah,
label.
yeah.
But was the only black oriented music, and we had to go all the way to Buffalo to get it. And
Yep,
we had about 10-15 years of fighting to get
yep.
our own radio station.
Yes,
And why I'm laughing is because everyone would be carrying all of these types of apparatus to be able to get the radio
yes.
station
Yes, and it's ridiculous, and
clear.
I talk yeah, and that is a huge section of my dissertation. I talk about how long it took for us to finally get a quote unquote urban radio station because that was
Yes.
associated with Black identities. And it's sad because we had such a thirst for that kind of music, but it was
Oh,
only we
everybody
wanted that.
of
Um,
non-Caucasian persuasion and
yeah.
even some Caucasian
Yeah, that's what I was
had
gonna say.
WBLK as their main music. And I
Yeah.
know my favorite part of it was the 11 o'clock show, which was, I forgot what they called it, but it was like soft musics and it was
Mhm.
always
Yeah,
that
yeah.
powerful R&B type music that you could sing to, Luther Vandross, all these.
Mhm, mhm. And it's crazy because you had to be in the southern part of Ontario to get those airwaves,
I'm telling
and
you, we walked around with
yeah.
like manual antennas
Yeah.
and leave it. And when you left Toronto, you could go just
Just at the tip,
past,
yeah.
like not quite Belleville, but just
Mhm,
before Belleville, like
mhm.
Brighton area was probably
Yeah.
how far you could get it.
Yeah, yeah, it was a really, really limited space, and, I talk about artists like Mishi Me, who is a hip hop artist in
Yes,
Canada,
I
and
know
she
BC.
yeah, and she used to talk about driving down to the States to get the records with her mom, or her mom would even drive down and get them and bring them back because we didn't have access to those records back then, records, CDs, cassettes. We didn't have those actually in Canada. Crazy. It's
Anyway,
crazy.
I just thought I'd take us down memory lane a bit because
No, it's
it just
funny.
to reinforce what
Yeah.
you're talking about and what we're seeing. But the other
Mhm.
side of it now has an aspect of perceived ownership, and I want us to talk about
Mm.
that a little bit.
Yes.
In when we talk about genres of music, there always seems to be this perceived ownership applied to it, whether it is country, because I love country and already I get cultural relationship pushback. When people hear
Yeah.
I like country, they're like, how do you listen? And I'm like, I love country, okay? Has
Yeah, yeah,
nothing
yeah.
to do with how I look.
I grew up in a really small town in Ontario. I have some country songs on my playlist. I can't blame
I
you.
I love country, and I always get a reaction when people realize I love country. In fact, I love most music. I can't think of music really that I can say I truly, truly hate. I'm pretty
Yeah,
well rounded, and I'm talking from classical to whatever. But people
amazing.
always have a reaction when I say I love music. I'm country. But there
Mhm.
seems to be this ownership perception going around, whether it's R&B, country, some of these genres that people seem to think they're only owned by these set of people.
Mm,
So
mhm.
talk about that a little bit.
Yes. So when I talk about Canadian artists of many different races trying to participate in R&B music, I talk about the challenges that they face because R&B music is traditionally associated with exclusively American and Black identities. So when we have racially diverse Canadian artists coming in and trying to participate in the space, they were challenged for their Canadianness and then oftentimes their race as well. And so when I was exploring this history, I found that, it was really important that I continued to look at where historically R&B came from. And a lot of it came from Black America. But on the other hand, I wanted to argue that although many of these cultural and genre styles was originally positioned in the States, we had so many Canadian artists collaborating and contributing as equally to that space as it developed in Canada. And I say that Canadian R&B is uniquely positioned because we had so many immigrants creating this music genre style and collaborating across many genres that were considered quote unquote Black music. And so our version of, R&B, our Canadian R&B, is filled with so many racial identities and so many cultural identities that it became an exemplary version of diversity in Canada. So although I say that knowing that historical component is necessary to understand the evolution of R&B, I say that as we see diverse identities participating in the space now, we can't exclude people from wanting to participate in a cultural practice. It's a cultural practice. It's not owned by anybody, but it's important to know the roots of where it came from.
If you're looking to advertise with Jenn Drakes, check the links in the description or reach out to us at jen@youareworthmore.co.
Interesting. And so let me put this on the table as because again, it was coming up as you were speaking, many things were going through my head. When you look at, say, an artist like Rihanna,
Mhm.
who is also from the West Indian culture, and she has certainly touched on many genres of music. But what was
Yeah.
interesting was some of her songs, she brought in the soca and
Yeah.
reggae beats, which
Mhm.
was, and everybody, especially back in the West Indies, recognized it, acclaimed it. To see it going mainstream, like out in that, it's no different to Bob Marley, how he popularized the reggae sound, right? And then
Mhm.
we saw Beyonce also put a number of those types of beats in her music. So, how do you look at that in terms of your view on the cultural aspects of things when artists do that? And some are accepted and embraced, some are get hit with all sorts of backlash. So how do you make sense of that?
I think that it's important. This brings us to the idea of the long debated battle between authenticity and appropriation. Who's allowed to authentically participate in any kind of cultural practice, and who's appropriating it in a way that it's understood that they're borrowing from that culture without truly being part of that culture. So when we're talking about this fusion of different genre styles and having diverse identities participating in the space, I think it's really up to a level of interpretation. I'm not one to say, I think this artist is authentic versus this artist
Mhm,
not being authentic in the space. But where I have this dilemma, I discuss it in my dissertation, for example, about Justin Bieber being a white Canadian artist
mhm,
participating in R&B, or Drake being a biracial Canadian and American artist participating in Canadian R&B, or Jessie Reyes being a second generation Canadian Colombian woman also
mhm,
participating in a predominantly Black American male genre style. So, does gender come into play? Does nationality come into play? Does race come into play? And at the end, ultimately, I argue that if it's a cultural practice, again, it shouldn't be safeguarded by certain individuals. And when you're talking about that definition, when I define contemporary Canadian R&B as represented by these three very different Canadian identities, I argue that they're different but equally Canadian. So they all have an equal right to participate
mhm,
in the space and represent themselves and label themselves as Canadian despite their different racial differences. So when I define Canadian R&B, I define it as like this mixture of traditionally separated music genre styles of the pop, the hip hop and the R&B, created more in the late 2020s and early 2000s by these Canadian citizens of different ethnicities, which can include Justin Bieber, Drake and Jessie Reyes, who participate in these different sounds and cultural representations and different styles. So I think that when you're talking about any artist in any genre style, it's again a personal opinion if they are authentically participating or not. But my personal opinion, you can't safeguard anything from anybody.
And
It's a
I think
cultural
as an
issue.
artist, but as an artist, that is your growth. Your growth is
Yeah.
exploration. Your
Hmm.
growth is, and some things you'll explore that won't work out, and some things will. When you
Hmm.
look, when I look at T-Pain, for example, he played around with, a type of music that many people previously did not do very successfully at all.
Right.
Many tried
Yeah.
way before T-Pain, but
Hmm.
T-Pain went right back to the history and
Hmm.
how it all came together. So when he did his sound, I think the authenticity of him came out, and he blew that whole thing out the water. To even today, people are still trying to do auto tunes,
Yeah.
much like T-Pain, but they're still not as top notch like T-Pain doing it. The other
And
one, yeah, the other one, I'll let you come on in a sec.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because I have two people in my mind with this. The other
Hmm.
one that is playing around with different sounds. Now, T-Pain got applauded for what he did, and to this day, he still is. But then
Yeah.
you look at someone like Post Malone,
Hmm.
who's been
Yeah.
exploring all these different, what could be perceived as, um, and again, my fingers are up, Black
Yeah.
Orient sounds, and the
Hmm.
backlash that he gets because his behavior and his mannerisms associated does not come across as respectful. So
Yep.
he gets a massive backlash for doing that type of music or even trying to play in that feel. So
Hmm.
talk to me about that, because I just find it interesting how so many are accepted in what they're doing. The Mariah Carey, I'll even call out one we talked about previous, was Tina Marie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tina Marie is as Caucasian as it can, but
Yeah.
man, open her mouth and belt out a sound, and it is, I am sorry, spiritually R&B,
Hmm.
deep, connecting. She is given acclaim for her voice and what she does as being authentic. I'm trying to understand and bring to the audience this understanding of who gets accepted and who doesn't. And I'm using Post Malone as that because I think he's the poster child in today's world
Yep.
for just a mixture of responses to his music.
It's so funny that you bring up Post Malone because originally when I was going to do this dissertation, I didn't have it narrowed down to Canadian artists, and
Mhm,
I was looking more broadly at just artists participating in this hip hop R&B fusion, and Post Malone was originally one of the artists I wanted to look at. And I 100% agree with you that he has gotten so much backlash from all the way from his tattoos to his
mm,
hairstyles to his like you're saying, his mannerisms and the music
mhm,
that he creates. And in the dissertation, I talk about the importance of understanding these preconceived notions that we all hold. When we hear a genre category, we tend to envision who, according to again preconceived notions, would fit into that genre category. And Drake, for example, has talked about Hotline Bling. He created that
mhm,
song, very poppy, but he said that he failed to have it categorized in the pop category despite it being undeniably pop because of his color of skin. Justin
mhm,
Bieber talks about the album Changes being intentionally R&B all the way, and he's describing the sonic styles,
mhm,
the type of instruments used in his music on that album, and yet he was pushed out of the R&B category because of his skin color. So whether it's in music genre categories, in the Juno Awards, the Grammy Awards, whatever kind of infrastructure you think about, a lot of the time they have certain identities they tend to group together, and that's how they create these genre categories. Originally, back in the day, we had segregation between certain genre categories. We
mhm,
had pop, country, folk, all pushed to be represented by white people and quote unquote what they considered white people. And then we had blues, reggae, soca, calypso, all those genre categories considered black music and put any non-white identities into those. So we still see that today. And just in 2020, Republic Records,
mhm,
they made a public announcement to strip the word urban from their verbiage because they said urban was so invested with so many racist and racially charged ideas that they wanted to
Mhm.
take it out of their verbiage. And that was 2020. We're not, that was only a couple of years ago, and we're still seeing these genre categories infused by these ideas of race. So that continues today, and that's why these artists are being challenged for their participation in what they're considered to not be authentic in.
But isn't that old world,
Yeah.
age, generational, past generational, pushing that forward, even though the younger generations are fighting it tooth and
Yeah.
nail? They are protesting. They're, trying to change things. Like,
Yeah.
is that correct that it's generational, meaning that at the head of this music industry and a lot of the decision makers fall into a certain generation and are still pushing their bias and stereotypes, while the younger generation that has been more open and embracing of others are saying this is nonsense, it needs to stop, it needs to change? Is that what we're really seeing interplay here in the music
Y-
industry?
Yeah, we continue to see that happening. And I will say the younger artists are trying to push back. They're saying that they don't want to be boxed in based on
Mhm,
these outdated ideas of what these genre categories should be. Tyler, the Creator, for example, he won a Grammy Award for the Best Rap Album in 2020. And he was saying, although he won, he was a winner of the Best Rap Album. He said that it sucks that whenever guys that he says, quote unquote, look like me, do anything that's genre bending, that they put us into a rap or urban category. And he doesn't like that urban word because it's
mhm,
a politically incorrect way, and this is in his words, of
mhm.
saying the N word to me. Because to him, doesn't matter what he does, he's continually pushed into these categories that are specifically associated and traditionally associated with Black identities. So he tries to be genre bending, but it doesn't matter
Mhm.
in the traditional outdated ways of categorizing artists based on their race. That
And this
continues to
might be a
happen.
difficult point that I put on the table, that so it's okay if you can't answer it, but what it has
Mhm,
me wondering is if someone other than an Indian came doing Bollywood, like
mhm,
if a big group created a Bollywood type song and dance, and they're not primarily East Indian. I'm curious, it's got me thinking, what would the reaction be? Would it be accepted, not accepted? Would it be backlash? Like, I start to think of this because right now we're talking about what's predominantly been associated with people of color. But what about other genre of music? Like even
mhm,
gospel, for example, right? Like what would happen and how the world would react if that occurred. And then I think of like Michael Jackson's, when he did the Egyptian, I forget the particular music, when he did that Egyptian video.
mhm,
That to me was a mixture of Bollywood and it was a mixture of Egyptian, and it
mhm,
also had very rhythmic things of West Indian in terms of
mhm.
some of the sounds. And that was accepted. That was maybe because it was Michael Jackson, who
Yeah,
knows?
yeah,
But
yeah.
it was widely accepted. And he didn't, as far as I recall, he didn't get a backlash from doing that. So there seems to be mixed messages or
Yeah.
mixed responses going
Mhm.
on. And what I
Well,
like is you're questioning to what degree should it be like that.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I don't even in my dissertation do this myself. I draw on so many artists who talk about it. Like I said, Tyler the Creator, even Frank
Mhm,
Ocean, and then Drake, as he's commonly challenged for being appropriating different cultures, whether he's rapping or singing in Spanish or different languages. And when he was challenged on it in 2019, he said that appropriation is taking it for your own personal gain and denying that it was ever inspiring to you from
mhm,
that culture. So he says that when you're not appropriating a culture, it means you're not supporting that culture or doing things that are deeply rooted within that culture. And so
mhm.
I think that's a really good way to put it because in that
Absolutely.
and yeah, because in that sense, anyone can participate in whatever they want as long as they are supporting that culture and are deeply rooted or embedded in that culture, because in that sense it's not superficial.
And
So
I think
I
too, if they're just showing a level of respect to the
mhm,
history of where that music came from and what it represents. I think there's a touchiness on any soul-based type of music because it came from pain.
Yes.
It came from, you know, demoralization, and it came from those places. So I think there's a sensitivity and an emotional connection that this is where this music was sourced from. And
Rightfully
any
so.
sense that is being disrespected or dismissed, that pain is being dismissed, that it gets a backlash. That's what I think. I don't know if
100.
I'm right, but I believe that's where a lot of the soul-based music sensitivities come from.
And I would agree with you. And when I talk about that history of R&B, I go all the way back to minstrelsy and how Black identities were represented in different kinds of music, and how that then came to fruition in contemporary music genre categories today. And I think it's really important to know that, Black identities were negatively represented in music, in those musical performances, and how hymn songs and slavery was embedded in some of the lyrics that artists were creating, that then came to fruition in developing what was quote unquote Black music, that over the years became R&B and hip hop, and how that came from such pain and the racism that many of those artists faced, that were pushed into those music genre categories. So I definitely agree with you there in terms of that pain being very, very important to that history. I think that that's very, very important. That's why I talk about the deep indebtedness that Canadian music has to American music, because it was a shared struggle that many of these artists faced, that they were fighting against that racism, that predominantly white space that many of those artists were trying to break into.
And I think also that's why T-Pain was accepted with his autotune, because he sourced it and perfected it based on coming from the mining industry, and he honored that. He called that out. He was very open about that, how he went back and studied how miners communicated, and that's how he got his perfecting of the autotunes. So I think as long as you pay homage and know that, you're not just taking it for a quick buck,
Yes,
right?
yes,
And you're
yes.
really honoring that history, I think that you get accepted. And Tina Marie also very embedded in the community and appreciative of, that just where the music came from. And I find those that do that are embraced, and all the ones that are given or send a message that they don't care or they
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
acknowledge, they get the backlash. That's what it
yeah.
seems to be.
And I would say even certain artists that do pay homage were also challenged for their participation. Like Justin Bieber in 2020, he says that I am inspired by Black culture. I've benefited off of Black culture. My style, how I sing, perform, and my fashion have all been influenced and inspired by Black culture. And yet he's paying that homage. He recognizes his white privilege. He knows he's a white Canadian artist that creates pop music. He's obviously gonna be in the periphery, or not in the periphery, but in the spotlight in mainstream society. He's in the center of society. But by saying, I participate in music that has been traditionally associated with Black artists, and have had so many Black artists before me try to pave the way for many other artists to participate in the space, he's still challenged based on his white identity for participating in R&B. So it's ridiculous to me, because early on, if you go all the way back into the discussion and you look at when he started music, he started with R&B music. He started doing covers
Yeah,
of Chris
that's how he was
Brown.
discovered.
Yeah,
Wasn't it
yeah,
Usher that
exactly.
discovered him? Wasn't it
It was
Usher? Am I correct?
it was Scooter Braun, and he was performing an Aretha Franklin song. Like, come on. Of course that was Black culture back then, but that was where he started his music. He loved that music. And then Usher, yes, in very early in his career, had helped craft his public persona and his image, Justin Bieber's image. And that was heavily inspired. Usher is the exemplary of R&B music, So of
Exactly.
course it was deeply influenced in how he performed and the music that he created, but it doesn't, his white identity came to be an obstacle for his acceptance in that space.
This is so interesting. Like, we could talk about this.
I know. And don't get me started.
And sadly, we've come to the end, so we're going to wrap up. So tell me, Dr. Amara, where do you see it going? What do you see as the next journey in this? Are we getting closer or are we getting further? Are we making strides or not?
Yeah. I think that, as you said, the newer generation is trying to push against these traditional ways of thinking. And with social media, we have so much access to collaboration and speaking out against these archaic ways that traditional industries have often organized society through. So I think that we are moving forward. We're seeing so many artists speak out on this. We're seeing so many people start to question and think about traditional ways of organizing music or just organizing identities through these categories. So I think that we're going to see a lot more pushback on traditional ways of organizing people through these racial constructs.
And I love when we land on hope because
Mhm.
this show is all about positivity and moving your life
Yes.
forward. So I'm so glad that we landed on a hopeful vision for where things are going. As a
Mhm.
human race, we've got to let go of this nonsense. This nonsensical way of looking at people and really just look at their energy, their heart,
Mhm.
their values, what they bring to the table, like literally, and
Yeah.
forget everything else because it doesn't define the person and it doesn't proclaim who the person at. We had a lot of other points we wanted to bring, but the music took it over, and I'm glad
Yeah.
it did because we hit up on a lot of things. I want to thank Dr. Amara for coming on here and having such an insightful, energetic conversation. That's what we do. Is there any last words or pointers to your website or anything that you want to make before we wrap up, Dr. Mara?
Yeah, I would love any if you think I'd be a great fit for any public speaking opportunities or any events, you can message me at www.dramarapope.ca. So that's at dramarapope.ca. And I want to keep pushing that idea forward of more acceptance, more inclusivity, and looking beyond these racial and national divides.
Well, we will definitely talk about having you on another inclusivity series on a different topic because I know we had other things to talk about that we never got to. So I've already made a note to get you on board again.
Aw,
So you will
awesome.
hear another episode at some point from Dr. Amara Pope and on an Arrays of Living. So with that, thank you so much. And you have been listening to another episode of Arrays of Living. And if you love what we bring to the table, the only way we can grow is by you sharing and passing our podcast through your friends and family networks. And we urge you to do that. With all my love from my heart to you. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Arrays of Living. If you've enjoyed this episode, check the links in the description for the other episodes, or tune in next week for the next episode.